Chapter 13, The Community Speaks. Outside City Hall, the plaza teemed with life. Protesters filled every corner, their voices weaving a tapestry of anger, hope, and determination. Signs bearing bold slogans like "Justice for Jason" and "End Police Brutality" bobbed above the crowd, their messages cutting sharply through the crisp evening air. The distant hum of traffic was drowned out by the rhythmic chants of the demonstrators. The air felt thick, almost electric, charged by the collective grief and resolve of the community. At the center of the commotion, Gloria Watts stood at the podium. The warm glow of the streetlights haloed her figure, illuminating the quiet strength etched into her features. Her upbringing had been a study in contrasts. Born into an upper-middle-class family, Gloria had been raised in a home where dignity and perseverance were taught alongside table manners. Her parents, both educators, had instilled in her a profound sense of justice and compassion. They had often reminded her of her privilege and the responsibility it carried to speak for those who couldn't, to fight for what was right. Tonight, that sense of duty burned within her. Dressed in a simple black coat that shielded her from the autumn chill, Gloria gripped the edges of the podium as though steadying herself against the weight of her own emotions. Her dark brown skin, flawless despite the years, glowed softly under the stage lights. Her natural curls framed a face that was both weary and resolute. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of neighbors, activists, and strangers united by a shared purpose. When Gloria spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone unafraid to bare her soul. Gloria Watts, Jason is not just a statistic. He's a son, a brother, a fiancé, and he deserves justice. The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers swelling like a wave and crashing against the walls of the surrounding buildings. Gloria closed her eyes for a brief moment, grounding herself in their energy, their support. When she continued, her voice rose with a passion that commanded attention. Gloria Watts, for too long we have watched as our sons, our brothers, and our fathers are taken from us. For too long we have endured a system that sees black lives as expendable. But tonight we say enough. Tonight we stand together. Tonight we demand change. The crowd erupted once more, their chants echoing into the night. Tears slipped down Gloria's cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. They were a testament to her grief, her love, and her unyielding resolve. Among the crowd, Kendra from the Firkin stood silently, her arms crossed over her chest. Her usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of guilt and quiet determination. Kendra had always been good at brushing off the brashness of the officers who frequented her bar, their crude jokes and dismissive attitudes. She'd laugh politely, pour another drink, and tell herself it wasn't her problem. But now, watching Gloria speak with such raw vulnerability, Kendra felt the weight of her own complacency. As the chants grew louder, Kendra made a silent vow. She would do better. She would be vigilant, more aware. She would stand with her community and use her voice to support the fight for justice. The atmosphere around City Hall buzzed with urgency and hope. People of all ages and backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices united in a symphony of resistance. Young activists handed out water bottles and candles for the vigil planned later that night. Elders shared stories of past struggles, their wisdom a guiding light for the younger generation. The collective energy was infectious, inspiring, and unrelenting. As Gloria stepped away from the podium, a young woman in the crowd passed her a candle, its small flame flickering in the breeze. Gloria accepted it with a nod, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions within her. She turned back to the crowd, her voice carrying over the chants once more. Gloria Watts, this isn't just for Jason, this is for every life lost to injustice. This is for every voice silenced, and this is for the future we must build together. The crowd quieted momentarily, her words sinking in like seeds planted in fertile soil. Then, as if ignited by her resolve, their chants resumed, louder and more determined than before. Gloria stood among them, not just as a grieving mother, but as a symbol of their shared fight, her flame held high against the darkness. Chapter 14. A Slow Awakening. Ethan Brooks sat stiffly in the small, nondescript office of the precinct psychologist. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee, a clinical mix that only heightened his discomfort. The room itself was devoid of personality, save for a couple of framed certificates on the wall and a generic landscape painting above the desk. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, making every crack and blemish on the beige walls more pronounced. Ethan crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched as he avoided eye contact with Dr. Ross, who sat across from him with a quiet, steady demeanor. Dr. Ross, a woman in her early 60s, radiated an air of calm authority. Her piercing gray eyes seemed to see through every layer of his defenses. Her silver hair was swept back into a no-nonsense bun, and her tailored navy blazer gave her an almost intimidating presence. But it was her voice, soft yet firm, that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Ethan," she began, folding her hands neatly on her lap, "tell me about that night." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. The familiar knot of guilt tightened in his chest. His foot tapped against the carpeted floor, a restless rhythm betraying his unease. "It wasn't supposed to go that way," he said, his voice low. "I knew Sean was on edge, but I thought I could manage him. I thought—" His voice faltered as the weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical force. Dr. Ross studied him, her expression neutral but attentive. "You thought it wouldn't escalate," she said, finishing his thought. "And yet it did. Why do you think that happened?" Ethan's head snapped up, frustration flickering in his blue eyes. "Because I froze," he admitted, the words escaping like a confession. "I hesitated when I should have acted. I didn't stop him." "And why do you think you hesitated?" Dr. Ross asked, her tone unwavering. Ethan ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his fingers tugging at the strands as though trying to pull the answers from his own mind. "Because I didn't want to rock the boat," he said after a long pause. "Sean's been my partner for years. He was my friend." Dr. Ross leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Ethan, acknowledging that fear is a step forward, but you need to ask yourself, what kind of officer do you want to be? What kind of man?" Her words cut deep, lingering in his mind long after the session ended. Ethan stepped out into the cold evening air, pulling his coat tighter around him. The city seemed to hum with its own restless energy, the sounds of honking cars and distant sirens filling the night. His breath formed pale clouds in the air as he walked, his thoughts churning with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Ethan's life outside the precinct had taken a dark turn. With his suspension and mounting bills, he had turned to a side gig he once would have condemned. The job wasn't glamorous, playing muscle for a criminal organization that operated out of a dingy bar on the city's outskirts. It was a place reeking of spilled beer and desperation, where shadows seemed to cling to every corner. Ethan's imposing figure and military background made him an asset, but every time he stepped through those doors, a part of him felt like it died a little more. Tonight he leaned against the bar's graffiti-scrawled brick wall, watching the room with a practiced eye. The patrons were a mix of hardened criminals and desperate souls seeking solace in liquor. Smoke hung heavy in the air, curling around the flickering neon lights that buzzed intermittently. Ethan's hand rested on the butt of the concealed weapon at his side, a reminder of the violence that could erupt at any moment. A man approached him, short and wiry, with a face that looked like it had taken one too many hits. "Brooks," the man said, his voice a low growl, "we've got a problem. Some guy's in the back refusing to pay up. Boss wants you to handle it." Ethan nodded curtly, his jaw tightening. As he made his way through the dimly lit bar, his footsteps echoed on the sticky floor. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a simmering resentment, toward the situation, toward himself. He pushed open the door to the back room where a scrawny man sat trembling, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent light. "You know the deal," Ethan said, his voice cold and detached. "Pay what you owe or things get messy." The man stammered, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his wallet. Ethan's stomach churned. He hated this, hated the way he had to harden himself to become a person he barely recognized. But he needed the money, and this was the only option left. When the ordeal was over, Ethan stepped outside, the crisp night air a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the bar. He lit a cigarette, the glow of the ember illuminating his weary face. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of it all, the guilt, the anger, the despair. Dr. Ross's words echoed in his mind. "What kind of man do you want to be?" Ethan exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing as he stared out at the city. He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing. The path he was on wasn't sustainable. Something had to change. Chapter 15. A Late Apology. The cheap motel room was bathed in the soft, golden glow of a flickering lamp on the nightstand. Ethan lay sprawled on the rumpled bed, his body half covered by a thin sheet. Beside him, a Latina escort stirred, her dark curls spilling over her bare shoulders. Her soft features and almond-shaped eyes bore an uncanny resemblance to Cynthia, a resemblance Ethan couldn't ignore when he hired her after his latest job in the underworld had left him with money to spare. Her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and spice, lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of cigarettes and cheap cologne. Ethan stared at the cracked ceiling, his mind a battlefield of guilt and longing. The woman beside him murmured something in her sleep, and he turned his head slightly to look at her. She wasn't Cynthia, and she never could be. But for a fleeting moment, she had filled the void he didn't want to acknowledge. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and pulled on his jeans. The motel carpet felt rough under his feet as he moved to the small window. Outside, the neon glow of a nearby diner sign cast shifting colors onto the empty parking lot. Ethan sighed deeply, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Sean was spiraling down his own dark path. The life he had once known was crumbling, his finances tightening to a stranglehold. His wife, Claire, had stopped asking questions about the overdue bills and their dwindling savings. Pride kept Sean from admitting the full extent of their troubles, but desperation finally drove him to call an old friend, a man with connections in the shadows of the city. It had been a tense meeting in a smoke-filled back room of a pool hall. The friend, a bulky man with a gravelly voice and a scar cutting through his eyebrow, had made it clear the work wasn't pretty, but it paid. And Sean, for all his bluster, wasn't in a position to be picky. Now Sean found himself standing guard outside a seedy club, his police badge swapped for the weight of a handgun tucked into his waistband. The night air was thick with the scent of sweat and spilled beer, and the muffled thud of bass from inside the club reverberated through his chest. Sean's green eyes scanned the crowd lining up at the door, his face set in a grim expression. He wasn't proud of where he had landed, but pride didn't pay the bills. Weeks later, Ethan stood outside Bay Ridge Hospital. The imposing building loomed over him, its bright lights a harsh contrast to the dimness that seemed to envelop his life. In his hand was a small bouquet of white lilies, their petals delicate against his calloused fingers. The thought of walking through those doors had haunted him for weeks, but his guilt had become an unbearable weight. Every day, Jason's face had haunted him, the fear in his eyes, the pain etched into his expression as Sean's actions spiraled out of control. Ethan couldn't erase the past, but the need to make things right for his conscience had finally driven him here. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The sterile smell of antiseptic immediately hit his senses, mingling with the faint hum of machinery and distant murmurs of hospital staff. The fluorescent lights were harsh, illuminating every scratch on the polished floors and every wrinkle in the tired faces of nurses passing by. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the long, quiet corridor as he approached the reception desk. Ethan. Jason Watts. The nurse at the desk glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and mild suspicion before giving him directions to Jason's room. Ethan nodded his thanks and began the walk, his heart pounding louder with each step. When he pushed the door open, the sight before him made his breath catch. Gloria was sitting by Jason's bedside, her hand gently resting on her son's. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her posture was straight, her presence commanding even in this vulnerable moment. Jason's face was pale but alert, his dark brown eyes half-lidded as he turned slowly to see who had entered. The beeping of the heart monitor punctuated the heavy silence in the room. Gloria's eyes widened when she saw Ethan, her lips pressing into a tight line. Her expression shifted from shock to simmering anger as she rose to her feet. "Gloria, you've got some nerve showing up here." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. He held out the bouquet awkwardly, unsure what else to do. "Ethan, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Jason's dark brown eyes locked onto Ethan's, his gaze unflinching. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. Jason, sorry doesn't change what happened. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of Jason's words pressing down on him. Ethan, I know, but I need you to know that I'm trying to be better. I failed you that night and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. Gloria crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly but still guarded. Her voice, though quieter now, carried an edge of resolve. Gloria, words are easy, Officer Brooks. Actions matter. Prove it. Ethan nodded again, his gaze never leaving Jason's. Ethan, you're right, and I will. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the faint hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Ethan placed the flowers on the small table by the bed and turned to leave, his chest tight with a mix of regret and determination. As he walked down the corridor and out into the cold night, he knew one thing. This was only the beginning of making amends.
To be continued. Thank you for listening to the audiobook The Other Side of the Law, written by Michael Liverpool. Be sure to click subscribe, hit the like button, ding the notification bell because there is more to come, and get in the comments and let your thoughts be heard. Thank you for listening and enjoy your day.